like it's one of those things. Clearly, we were just meant to hang out a little bit longer, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it's up to you. If there's more stuff you wanted to touch on, happy to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk about the anti-Muslim sentiment that is still on the rise somehow. And even like here in London, like the whole attack on the mayor. And I just wanted to take your opinion on it. Why is it that now, like racism is really frowned upon, but somehow being anti-Muslim or Islamophobic passes like kind of cool, it's fine. What's that about? Is it because we don't have hip hop?
We do. Come on now.
No,
Loki's been holding it down. Lupe Fiasco, there's a few of them. Riz. No, I take your point. I think there's a few things at work. I think that so the scapegoating obviously of communities to detract attention from the real causes of our misery has been happening forever. But then the way in which we refer to those groups has changed in the way that white supremacy adapts to the attempts that communities often make to try and challenge it. So, for example, an example of that would be the campaigns that have led to, race equality legislation and, what we would call normatively today, the sort of idea that you can't, even though people do, speak casually in a racist manner and not be frowned upon, right? That's sort of a consequence of a battle that's been fought and that has led to some legislative change. I think that anti-Muslim sentiment gets round the sort of anti-racial critique by sort of obviously emphasizing the idea that this critique has nothing to do with the racial identity and is just to do with the ideas of the people at hand. And we know that obviously isn't true. We know that, the reality is that people who are not just visibly Muslim but perceived to be visibly Muslim, including people like Sikhs, after 9/11 have been attacked, that there is always an interaction between the sort of historical forms of racism and the new permutations that we see that sort of slip through the crack holes to allow a new form of kind of socially acceptable racism. And so I think in that sense, Islamophobia is one of the forms of socially acceptable racism today. We really mean, in France, the Arabs, the North Africans, but we'll say Muslims.
Yeah.
We really mean the Pakistanis and the Indians here, but we'll say Muslims. And I think that that's where it's sort of just another form of white supremacy is a shapeshifter. And so I think it really is, it changes to try and maintain dominance, and it slips through cracks and finds its new, ways to consolidate. And of course, the other reason is that, post 9/11 and I think post ISIS, we have a kind of perception here in the West of Islam being a dangerous and violent force. And I think that on one hand, it's really interesting to think about that in the context of Western history, where the Islamic Empire was the last bulwark of resistance to the emergence of the current forms of Western empires that have dominated the globe. The annihilation through various forms of sort of seditious enterprise of the Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century was the last form of even ideological resistance to the values of kind of liberal capitalism which exists today. And so I do think that part of the Islamophobia is rooted in this sense of Islam being this historical foe, but I also think it lies in the actual very real challenge that Islamic values do pose when they are wielded by enlightened leadership to a materialistically centered world view. Now, just to caveat that, obviously a number of Muslim majority countries are led by people who, in my view, have capitulated to the capitalist world view, whereby Islamic values are now just a quaint, decorative sort of, illusion that's maintained for the sense of, historical continuity and popular legitimacy. But in terms of Islamic values actually being core to how many so-called Muslim majority states think about their values, beyond how women should dress, which of course is, the most absurd and the most attended to. I'm talking about fundamental values of equality and fairness and justice and transparency and, even the notion of the accessibility of leadership. In the Muslim tradition, these are leaders who are meant to be accountable to the people. These are people who historically you could go up to and, make your criticism to. I mean, not in every civilization, but it's certainly the idea that leadership was something that was necessarily responsive to the people. That's obviously lost in pretty much most Muslim majority countries today. I think there's a lot going on with that. There's historical reasons why Islam is always the baddie. There's, I think, maybe deeper reasons why it poses an ethical challenge to our current worldview, as do probably most spiritually centric worldviews. And I think finally, like I said, white supremacy has just learned to dance the dance with the meaningful but limited gains that the anti-racist movement has achieved.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I once had this conversation where, I think I was told, but you cannot deny that there's terrorists coming from your country, and or Muslim terrorists. And I said, and I just raised that question out of curiosity. I was wondering how many Western people died of the hands of terrorist Muslims, and how many Muslim people died on the hands of Western leaders.
Right.
And it's just
the disproportionality is intense. And I think, as somebody who's been living obviously in the Middle East, on and off for, and I'm very grateful to that for big parts of my life. Like I obviously live there now. It's insane to me how little recognition there is in the West of how terrorizing a force America and Western forces have and continue to be in the region. I mean, the death and destruction which has accompanied the so-called, humanitarian or democratic or whatever BS veneer that has been placed on them. Look for, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Libya. Like, it's very difficult to look at the region and think that the West has played anything but a harmful role in what's happening. And that's only to mention the countries that have been, in many cases invaded. But I'm also talking about the destabilization of countries. The fact that Lebanon obviously hasn't had a government for a significant amount of time now. Tunisia is in turmoil. I think that, as much as it's not kind of always about blaming external forces, there are external forces who have and continue to have a strong political interest in destabilizing the region, and the people have paid the highest price.
So are you hopeful? You said something about not our generation. So
am I hopeful? I think that there's a few things that do make me hopeful. Young people's responses to this in particular is one of them. The student encampments are wildly misunderstood, I think probably very deliberately by some people. But what they actually represent is formidable and inspiring and incredible. And I just want to give a shout out to all the students who are literally holding it down right now in forms of direct resistance against the state. It's impressive and necessary, and literally providing, I think, hope and inspiration to many people. And I want to say that on that note, let's just take a second to think very clearly about what encampments represent. So encampments and occupations of university campuses are students making a physical reclaim of the territory that is meant to be governed by the state. And it's a territorial reclamation of that land, in which you then say, in this space, we don't recognize your authority anymore. This rule that you're bringing to us, not here. In this space, we have our own rules. In this space, we create values that are aligned with what we think is right. And so if you look, for example, at Colombia, but it's not just true at Colombia. Colombia had a very clear vision of the values of the encampment, and that was reflected in an environment where, you would have people sharing Shabbat, you would have, the nut-free zone, you would have, a real attempt to, they would have, anti-Black racism teachings, they would have anti-Semitism teachings. Like this was a reclaiming of a space in order to reassert what our values should truly be, and to cultivate them in a very deliberate fashion within that space. And so there is a huge amount of hope in that, because those free zones, which is what those spaces are technically free zones. If you think about the analogy of war and resistance, these students have literally created free zones for this movement. Then each and every one of us should be looking to expand the free zone. If there's anything I would hope anyone listening to this would take away, it's that, the students have got started with the literal territorial liberation of physical space. That mantle needs to be taken up by the rest of us. We need to free this whole space.
Yeah, I relate so much. My background is the Egyptian Revolution. It really defined who I am, and it was the same. I was taking up space, Tahrir Square,
right?
Which we lost now. Hopefully, we don't lose more space.
Tell us some lessons that you learned from Tahrir Square that maybe could be helpful to the students today who are going through these, there's all this pressure. How do you maintain those encampments? How do you maintain the ethos? How do you avoid some of the pitfalls maybe that came your way in Tahrir?
I think, so many things come to mind, but I think everybody has their own revolution, and that's okay. But it's about how to sort of find the balance and the compromise where how do we find that bigger revolution that makes our individual revolution, all our individual revolutions come true, kind of thing. That, and there's also this other thing of just leaving the main thing and going into alleyways, and that's always, that division is always not good.
Yeah.
So that's what I learned from the Egyptian Revolution. I think it's a bit abstract, but
no, I think I understand. And of course, there was, for people who weren't familiar with it, obviously Tahrir Square brought together very different currents of Egyptian society, right?
Yeah.
Who all had a common objective, which was the removal of the dictator Mubarak at the time, and the idea that what would come about would be a free, democratic Egypt. But obviously, people had different visions of what that free, democratic Egypt would lead to or would look like, and some of that, I guess, is what you're alluding to in terms of, you know, everyone having different visions of what that would look like. I think that's definitely also true in this movement, when you have a common enemy, for want of for want of another word. Although I think that it's really important in the movement not to think of anyone or anything as an enemy. I think the enemy is injustice. The enemy is oppression. There is no individual that represents evil. There's no human beyond redemption. And even as we experience the dehumanization and the horrors, I think one of the big traps to avoid is not buying into the mirror image of those who are causing the violence towards you, and therefore internalizing. And this is the struggle of all colonized people vis-a-vis the colonizers, right? Is that, you know, in many ways, the colonizer, as Fanon would tell us, teaches us the medium, the language of how to respond. You know, if you deal with us with violence, you've taught us that the language that we interact with is violence. Okay, you've literally explained it. You've come and communicated with us through the language of violence. We've understood the violence. We're going to reply with violence. The real question is, like, for any movement, and this has nothing to do with the resistance on the ground, which is a completely separate question, because of course Article 1 of the Geneva Convention permits occupied people to resist occupation by any means possible. Something
that we don't hear mentioned for like almost a year now.
Something that we never hear mentioned, and which is ultimately a huge hypocrisy, particularly I think for US audiences, who for the most part have the right, if somebody comes onto their property, to shoot that invader dead.
Kill them,
and most people, you know, will defend the right to bear arms, and would say that if somebody came into their home and threatened their family and their children, that they would have a right to defend their family. And somehow, again, in the sort of, you know, hierarchy of human value, we've decided that, you know, that applies to American men, but, you know, Arab men, definitely Palestinian men, doesn't matter how many bombs get dropped on you, it doesn't matter how many Israeli soldiers storm into your house and attack you and your family and your olive groves and your children and wreck your house and beat you up. No, you were never allowed to respond to that, even though they are an occupying force illegally present within your home. Facts. So that's a whole other space, of course. But I mean it more generally in the ethos of the resistance movement globally, which is that the big challenge, and I think, you know, the students at Columbia did a brilliant job of this in sort of laying out their ethos and values, and other campuses have done the same, is that those values of the dehumanizing forces are not our values. They are not what guides us. Vengeance with regards to that, reaction to that, is not what guides this movement. This movement is the same movement that says, you who's today advocating for genocide, if tomorrow you were the victim of genocide, we would come out and fight for you too.
Yeah, exactly.
End of. It doesn't matter who you are. It's almost irrelevant to us.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters is that if you were in this situation tomorrow, we would fight for you, even with everything you said until now. And that's the beauty and the strength of the movement. And that's the sort of moral or philosophical purity that I think we have to retain in order for this to be able to be not just a movement that brings about ultimately not just a ceasefire, but obviously the liberation of Palestine, which is what this movement is about. Let's not get it twisted. A ceasefire is no longer the goal, and I think everyone has to be really clear about that today. Tomorrow a ceasefire, right? It's a free everyone, and it's a free Palestine, and exactly right. And I think that we have to reassert that, because there will be a time very soon where that ceasefire will come about. And the US has already made clear signs that it will try and present Netanyahu as being the sort of bogeyman. Maybe one or two members of his cabinet, they will likely face some limited form of accountability. We'll be told it was these extremists. We can already see it, that they're sort of preparing the new leadership to come through and sort of trying to distance them. And we have to say, we are not accepting this.
Yeah.
This is another ploy to try and make us believe that the situation is tenable in a long-term capacity, and it's not.
Yeah. That's what I was kind of also trying to say when I said, like, just remember the main goal and don't go into alleyways in that way, because that's what happened in the Egyptian revolution. They kind of like, these people have always good ways of just like distracting you and making you think that what you wanted happened.
Yes.
And
absolutely. Well, look, even the recognition of Palestine, which is sort of coming through quite late in the last few weeks through a number of European countries, catching up with the global South, which has long recognized Palestine, right? I think that it's interesting to me that those recognitions are coming through now, when there is no actual physical territorial basis for a Palestinian state. 80%,
not at all now,
right?
Yeah,
80% of Gaza has been destroyed and it rendered unlivable until at least 2060. So there's almost 1.7 million people for sure are going to be, quote unquote, and there's very big quote unquotes, voluntarily relocated. Hold on, where did we hear that? When did we hear that? Months ago. Months ago, the Israelis told us that was the plan, and that's exactly what they've done. So that now Gaza is completely unlivable, and the majority of Palestinians will most likely find themselves in the Sinai, where we know that the Egyptian government has been preparing, a series of tent cities.
No, they are doing it for people off Sinai.
Of course, that's who it's really for. How silly of me. So yeah, we are realistically looking at a situation where, when you say we recognize a Palestinian state, what you're essentially saying is you recognize a number of essentially enclaves in the West Bank, which are in many cases not even interconnected, as in the people who live in them can't even travel to other parts of that territory. The model that we see today is much closer to the reservation model, which is the classic US colonization model that strips indigenous communities of all meaningful political and land-based rights, and essentially creates these reservations where they are allowed to exist as sort of apolitical indigenous people on these lands. That is where we are headed with the current situation. And I think that the recognition of Palestine thing, it's not my place as a non-Palestinian to decide what the solution for this is long term. However, I'm aware that for many Palestinians I know, including many who live still in the occupied territories, this doesn't even what are we even talking about? What is this state that you're recognizing? Are you recognizing a state within 1967 borders? Cool, because if you are, now let's talk about the withdrawal of the Israelis to those borders. But if you're just talking about this abstract notion of a state without the necessary demands for Israel to withdraw from territories it has been occupying illegally for decades, I don't know what it is that we're even really talking about. Yeah.
So you spoke about how, as an artist, you want to tell the stories, the untold stories. You want to put these untold heroes in the front of your stories. And I wanted to ask you, Do you think, and obviously now we see all these arguments about like people being cancelled for not using their platform or people being cancelled for using their platform. What do you think the responsibility of artists or people with platform is? Is there a responsibility? What is it? And how do you see it?
Well, firstly, I would start by saying that it's a responsibility that I've seen artists take up in a very proactive way. There were, there's obviously a group called Artists for Palestine and, filmmakers for Palestine. And in these communities, I've seen people withdraw their labor. There were a number of artists, for example, that were active around the attempts to get Israel banned from Eurovision, who withdrew their labor at a cost to them, because ultimately I think that when we're talking about artists, we're also often talking about economically marginalized communities. There's not very many rich artists. There are some, but they're the minority. Most people are lucky if they can survive off their artwork. And I think that withdrawing your labor when you're basically living hand to mouth, as many people are, is a hugely important and honorable form of resistance. And so I think we've seen some of that. We'll continue to see some of that. I think in general, we can only make institutions listen when there is an economic impact on them. We can obviously say to them, we disagree with you being funded by X, Y, and Z. I'll still exhibit, but X, Y. We don't think you should take money from these people. We don't think you should be invested in these corporations or whatever it may be. But ultimately, I'm trying to remember who it was. I did a TikTok about her speech at one of the awards ceremonies recently on the red carpet. This actress talking about, the reality is that the oppressors do not give you your rights because they wake up one day and think, out of the goodness of my heart, I need to recognize the humanity of these people.
They don't.
That doesn't happen. Yeah, I know. I wish it did too, because you'd kind of hopeful that could happen. But no, that's not what happens. The reality is that you create a situation where it becomes so economically untenable for the current status quo to continue that the oppressors have to change their modus operandi. And I say change rather than the idea that somehow the oppressed will win out in that engagement, because back to my earlier point, white supremacy is a shapeshifter, so it will just rework around this new configuration, which is why America's civil rights movement is an ongoing movement. It's not done. It's not over, but there are gains made along the way. But for every gain that's made, white supremacy readapts to the new configuration and finds new ways to kind of maintain that power structure as best it can. And so I do think that the economic leverage is the single most important leverage. That's why the students are, not just students, but obviously the wider BDS movement is all about, boycott, divest, sanctions, make sure that we are not feeding the economy of this country that's engaged in genocide when it comes to Gaza specifically. But I think that that's a position that as citizens, each and every one of us should be thinking through a lot more seriously in terms of all of our economic engagements. The Congo obviously is another issue that's coming up a lot right now. I mean, how many of us, for example, as much as with Palestine and Israel, we know exactly who the baddies are, right? America is funding and providing weapons to Israel, as is the UK. And Israel is committing these actions. So the kind of the directness of our focus in terms of pushback is very clear. We need to stop Israel being able to do these things. And the way you do that is you push back against the US and you push back against the UK. In the Congo, we are talking about large corporations who are selling us back products that most of us, including many communities with proximity to that particular issue, are very happy, making promotional videos for, creating the soundtrack for the new Apple advert, or buying an iPad for your, for your missus or your miss, or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, it's very, it's very integrated into our digital native lives, where, this is part and parcel of how we operate. Like, how are we meant to operate without an iPhone? But genuinely, if we are serious about tackling these issues, then as consumers, which is one of the forms of economic power that we hold, it's not the only one, but it's a big one, we have to become much more discerning in our consumerism.
Yes.
And we have to, it's the same with fast fashion. It's like, we can sit around and say we object to kind of 7-year-olds in Bangladesh sewing our clothes together, but unless we stop buying from the companies that are doing that, and we start making much more assertive, in some cases I would even use the word aggressive, decisions in how we shop, we will get exactly what we want. Which is, we say we want cheap fashion on a regular basis, so we're getting cheap fashion on a regular basis. Like, you kind of, so to me, that they're quite distinct. And I make this distinction because I know that a lot of people online sort of say, oh, people speak up for Gaza, but they don't speak up for the Congo, they don't speak up for Sudan. And I don't think that they are, firstly, I think it's an attempt to divide oppressed communities along completely aleatory lines. Like, the Palestine struggle connects to, our democratic struggles here. It connects to over policing here and in America that affects African American community. Like, there are so many ways in which Gaza is touching on things that affect us directly, even before we get to solidarity with the Palestinian people, just for being people who are being starved, bombed, denied water, medicine, etc. But I think that the kind of trap that is set sometimes is this idea that you have to only pick the battle that has that you have personal proximity to. And I would say that it's actually about kind of understanding with each of these where your personal point of leverage stands with regards to it. So for example, if I am let's just take my example. So on Gaza, on Palestine in general, I have a more direct proximity because of my identity, because of my faith, because of my history. And so I'm going to lean into the spaces where I have leverage in the media, in any public work that I do. But in other areas, other people can lean into theirs. I've met bakers who started making cupcakes with watermelon signs on them. That was her daily, she said, every day during this, I've made these cakes. And, that's my way of keeping it in the public conscious. I say that's all of that is part of the struggle.
Various forms of resistance.
Yeah, there are various forms of resistance. And I think, not to get caught up in these sort of divisions that are being pushed sometimes, that I think ultimately only serve to weaken a much wider coalition of resistance that has never been more important than it is today.
That's a very good point. Well, Myriam, you've been amazing. I know you're a very busy woman, so thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And honestly, I'm very inspired by talking to you.
So much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. Great work that you're doing, obviously, here. Art is the space to have these conversations, and art is one of the last remaining spaces of freedom for us in this society. So thank you for what you guys are doing. Keep up the great work, and hopefully, much more to come.